coordinator, and he said there is a hope that the Arab Spring will have an impact there, but that hope hasn't materialized yet. And with the support of France for Morocco, we're not really getting much progress. And with Algeria then on the other side, things are a bit stuck, and there is an express wish on the EU side that we would want to take up in the Parliament. We want to push for independent investigations to be carried out, looking at the human rights situation in the Western Sahara and in the refugee camps. You may be aware of this if you've been involved in the details of this, but within the EU, for the first time, we now have a human rights dialogue, not a public dialogue, but a dialogue with Morocco, but without Western Sahara. So all of the reforms were focused on Morocco, but not specifically Western Sahara. Then we have learnt lessons from this transformation process. And very often at the EU level, there was discussion in January and February about the political failure of the EU being very clear. No one really properly weighed up the situation. People weren't aware of the strength of civil society and the ability that it had to bring about a transformation. And there was really a political failure almost on the side of the EU in terms of the stability of dictatorships for decades. We didn't say a word then about human rights infringements, because within the EU and in member states, it was felt that it was more important that the borders were fixed. That was regarded as more important. People who didn't have legal status here were sent back to Libya. We knew in some cases that they would be tortured and that they would not be safe, but we turned a blind eye because it was more important to us to shut down borders. We weren't really consistent with our criticism on human rights. And there was torture, even the use of the death penalty in these countries, and we didn't criticize it for political reasons. So I think it is about learning lessons. We had principles which are supposed to be a hallmark of the EU, that we want to protect and promote human rights, but it wasn't taken seriously enough. Now that we've learned those lessons, that needs to be put into practice through specific policies. Now, I arrived rather late today. I'm sorry not to have heard everything that Mr. Mingarelli said, but as an MEP, I don't always get an answer in terms of what the Italian government is doing with the Tunisian government bilaterally when it comes to securing borders. I support the idea of mobility. I think it's an important part of neighbourhood policy. It's not only important for the medium-sized businesses, it's also important for those who want to work. We need to organise things. We don't want so many people pushing to migrate illegally, and we haven't seen enough detail on what's happening there. And we've really done nothing at all to ensure that people who are forced to flee are dealt with properly. We have people fleeing from Libya, which was the richest country. The EU did help people who had left to be brought back, but that's not really a future for people in Libya. They don't have work there, so we now need to ensure that people get the jobs back that were once available in Libya. And secondly, there are many people who were stranded in Libya because they couldn't get onto Europe. They, in many cases, don't have training or education. They don't have the kinds of skills that we want. However, for humanitarian and human rights reasons, they cannot go back to their own countries, whether it's Eritrea or the Côte d'Ivoire or Somalia. So they've been there since January, and Ms. Gomez and I can raise this at every meeting, But the member states are simply deaf to this. They're not willing to act. There's not the slightest political will to care about the fate of these people who, for humanitarian people, ought to be received. The UNHCR has also looked at whether they would qualify, and I think the EU has completely failed. Fewer than 200 people have been accepted out of that group of people who can't go forwards or backwards. President Buzek visited this area a few weeks ago and said, well, fewer than 200 people have been taken up and there are more than 3,000 people there. And there we haven't learnt any lessons. So, for example, in Germany, no permanent reception programme has been set up for cases of this kind, and we need that to ensure that we don't have to fight for every single case. And what have we learnt in terms of our border controls? Well, this is something that we learned something about before this transformation process. Commissioner Malmström gave the Parliament the task of looking at the EU Agency for Border Security, Frontex, and trying to ensure that it also had a human rights part to its mandate. It didn't used to have this. Colleagues from the previous legislative period told me that when the head of this agency came along and was asked what he actually did when it came to his presence on the ground in order to support people who in some cases were fighting for their lives, people sometimes caught at sea, and he said, well, they don't do anything because they don't have a mandate when it comes to human rights. Now we do have some movement, but I can only speculate on how it will be implemented. I think it will take more time before we can say whether things are actually being dealt with better. In the Parliament itself, in our Subcommittee for Human Rights, we have tried to ensure that in every meeting we take one country from the countries involved in the Arab Spring and we have a good look at it and see what we can pick up on in terms of human rights developments. And there are certainly differences between the different countries. It's not just about elections and trying to ensure that the elections are organised effectively. It's also about the construction of state structures, civil society structures. And this should help to improve the human rights situation on the ground. That's the main concern. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I know, and you've remarked it, that you've